Steve Voss from the University of Kentucky. Contrary to the program, I do have a co-author with this project. In fact, I'm not a Balkanist. It's my co-author who's got the regional familiarity. For most of the project, I'm really more the data monkey. But in this one, a little bit of an exception. My co-author, RidvanPeshkopia, is there in the audience getting a little of this on film for the grant agency, which so generously supported the research. We got our money from the Swiss, specifically the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, a grant administered through the University of Fribourg. They have a program called the Regional Research and Promotion Program, which focuses on the Western Balkans, and they supported the survey work that I'm going to show you here. Now, it's common to say that something is a work in progress. This is no exception. It's very much a work in progress, but I can be a little more specific for you. The survey is not a work in progress. It's gone out to the field. The data have come back, and that stage is done. However, we hope to take a second wave in the field, so we would certainly recommend suggestions on there. Usually, when I'm in the audience and people have already done a survey, I feel as though, well, I would have loved to have given you some advice on how to do that better, but it's too late. That ship has sailed. That is not necessarily the case here, so we would appreciate some commentary on the survey methodology. The data work is ongoing, and the results, while they're preliminary, the reason they've stayed preliminary is primarily because we've got non-findings. And that's the challenge we face, of course, is we can pretend that non-findings are scientifically interesting, but the journals don't really think so. So we're taking our time trying to figure out if we have any findings. Oh, okay, is this actual? Ah, thank you. I didn't know the viewers still use that. In class, I used the regular. Okay, so as with a couple of the papers before this one, the broader theoretical framework that I've brought to the migration side of our research has to do with this disagreement over what drives interethnic relations and how people react to outgroups when they come into contact with them. This is an area that I've, for many years, worked in American politics, and is from working with race in the United States and to a lesser extent migration and immigration in the United States that I developed interest in these theories that Ridvan and I are only now trying to apply to migration topics. In at least the U.S. context, the sort of rational competition theory that Garvey had introduced to you has been called various things. The group threat hypothesis is the more general name, and therefore the one I would feel most comfortable applying to a new context. And it's associated in its origins in the United States with V.O. Key Jr., who studied the U.S. South, followed by Michael Giles of Emory University, who also developed it primarily in the U.S. South. It was in the hands of Michael Giles, who gave it the group threat name, very much a materialist hypothesis. The idea was there were material things of value, you fought over them, and therefore when two groups in larger numbers came together, conflict got worse. I could add here a sociologist, Blaylock, who was also part of that literature. It was a materialist idea. And it boiled down to a fairly simple expectation, which is as groups came into proximity, you got more hostility. And really, it was that correlation that people were looking for that drove the literature, much less so than the ideas that underlay where those expectations originated. Our names are more similar for what is often portrayed as the rival idea, the contact hypothesis. This idea is, as you saw previously, associated with Gordon Allport. I responded in my earlier research specifically to some work in the American context by Thomas Carsey, and I often find myself cited as one of these people, in my opinion, in error. So that's why it says me, but with the expression of alarm. I'm convinced that one person made that mistake, and everybody else has been stealing their citation and without actually reading the work ever since, which is how these things tend to happen. This is in the U.S., and let me stress, this is in the U.S. context, a psychological model, not a material model. And Duncan, if you're thinking, why is he saying that? It's because I'm going to talk back about your work in a second. There's a good point, I think, to make here. Psychological, in a sense, what happens? I come into contact with the outgroup, I realize, oh, gee, they're not all that bad. I had some stereotypes about them. I realized maybe they're not quite true. They don't have three heads. Now that I know this, I'm less racist, I'm less intolerant, and my ignorance is gone, and I don't mind the group so much. And under this expectation, the more I find myself in proximity with the group, I would get the regional pattern that you saw in your maps, right? I would expect more tolerance in the places where people actually came into contact with the group in question. There are historical cases that fit both of these very well empirically. The U.S. South fit very well with the group threat hypothesis. In places where there are more African Americans, the backlash against integration was most severe, clearly, most severe. Examples that would seem to fit the contact hypothesis. If you look at patterns of anti-Semitism in France, leading up to the World War II period, what you find is the people who lived in areas with Jews, they tended not to be the ones supporting the anti-Semitic candidates, the anti-Semites. You went out into the places where people may have never met someone of Jewish ethnicity, and that's where the greatest intolerance. So we know that there are historical examples where either of these patterns of proximity do appear, and now we need to start refining the theory. Now, I have rebelled against this, and in a sense, therefore, criticized the previous talk. I have rebelled against this duality, because it's conflating a mechanism and a prediction. All right, the mechanism, material versus psychological. The prediction, you get proximity, the sign goes one way versus the other. And the reason has to do with what Duncan told you. You often see in the literature when applied comparatively rather than in the United States, which is there's this possibility of cultural threat, right? There can be stakes. They can be at risk. You can be fighting over them. It's not mere perception, but it's not money. It's not salaries or work. Now, I've tried a couple of names for this idea that I've pushed most recently in a book chapter coming out not too long from now with Rutledge. David Leal is the editor I work with, but he's not the lead author of it. I called it at one time earlier in my work, in my dissertation, which was way back in 2000, before you guys probably even got to college. I tried calling it an assimilation hypothesis. The idea was that when you're, for an extended period of time, in contact with a group, your interests can converge. Groups can become more like each other and start to share interests. Over time, I decided that was a little bit of a simplification, so I've gravitated to a better, I think, label for it, which is the shared interest hypothesis. There are times when proximity doesn't make you less stupid, doesn't sort of solve you of this psychological disease. What it does is it causes your interest to converge. So this will not apply in the European case, but I'll give you an example. If you've got neighborhoods in a U.S. city that have a large African American population and other neighborhoods that have none, and someone proposes a program to help minority economic advancement so that they have more spending money to spend in stores and to drive down crime or other such things, who gains among the in-group, the whites, who gains from that money being distributed? The one whose stores they'll patronize, the ones who, as the money floods in, they also benefit from the multiplier effect. So you can have a shared interest. One example, I think, of this at work is the piece I published in the Canadian Journal of Political Science having to do with the opinions of the Quebecois toward, I'll use the term independence. It was voting in referenda, and it's more complicated than that. But anyway, the point is, it was the Francophones who lived in proximity to more Anglophones who opposed the more secessionist movements. There were different things. The more secessionist policies, the more independence-oriented policies, and it was the Francophones who were isolated, who saw no cost, who did not share the interests with the Anglophones in Quebec. So I found examples of this in the past. All right, now transit countries in the Balkans that have migrants passing through seemed to us, when we were conducting the survey, to be an interesting case for testing these ideas for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is possible to have quite varied orientations toward this clandestine migration through the region. On the one hand, you can look at it as a negative. Crime sometimes results, corruption of public officials sometimes results, and people maybe are bribed to let the migrants pass. Sometimes bad things happen to the migrants, whether they're at land or sea. They may be thrown out of a boat to escape Coast Guard. People have been raped, and so on. Or you can attach a very positive subjective orientation to this. They don't plan to stop. They're just passing through. They're seeking a better life. Well, who are we to stop them? We know people others who've gone on through migration, we should not be feel negatively toward this transit population moving through. Second thing that seemed to make it valuable for testing ideas is that you get good variation in X. If you're smuggling people and it's technically illegal, you don't want to make a big show of them. You try to keep them in vans. You try to keep them away. Nonetheless, they don't always succeed. Sometimes these migrants are, because accidents happen, or they're left by a smuggling group to kind of fend for themselves for a while. They sometimes do come in contact with some of the populations, and sometimes they get stuck, and then they have to settle in a community. Now, because they get stuck, because it's not part of the plan, when you do get this exposure, it's probably not endogenous. It's probably not that the Albanians who run into these migrants, the Serbs who run into these migrants, chose to. Most of them probably didn't, and it just happened that you started getting a backup of people. All of a sudden we notice there are all these people there. We go see what's going on. You need health care. You're sick. It's probably not a voluntary exposure. It's going to be the authorities, the employers who are approached for employment when they get stuck, urban pedestrians in public squares and whatnot, where we sometimes ran into some of these migrants selling watches or such things. We in fact encountered not a small number of these clandestine migrants who were very non-clandestinely selling watches and other things in the public square. So what we wanted to mine to study this question is a larger survey that we put in the field in the summer mostly. It was a rolling survey called Beyond Ethnic Divisions. It was intended primarily to study other questions. It was not primarily oriented toward the migration questions. We've had much better success getting results out of the ethnicity and social division part than we've gotten out of the migration part. It ended up being a 5-country public opinion survey, at least formally: Albania, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, and Macedonia. We did not. We took some surveys in Greece that we may add later, but they were not part of the formal survey, so I don't have them listed here. We applied a novel survey design. We started out with a stratification within each country, in which we tried to have our interviews not selected for randomization, not selected for representativeness, but in a non-probability way to try to stratify across types of communities. In every case, we did surveys in the country's capital. We tried to find another large city, up to 3 of them. If we could find one with the majority dominant, if we could find one with the minority dominant, not so common, or if we could find one with a balanced population. You can't always get them in each country, but when we could. We tried the same breakdown by towns, smaller towns when we could, and even more rural village populations, again, when we could identify them. The final stratification was whether they're exposed to smuggling, whether they're part of the Balkan Route where migrants customarily pass, versus communities that were more insulated. There's not so many of those in some of these countries. The result was, this is just an example, I don't expect you to read the places, but the point was we essentially had a grid that we tried to fill in as best we could for getting at the variable of whether they're exposed to the smuggling route, and then who's in control of the community to represent their orientation toward minority groups. All right, the interviews, they were face-to-face, conducted by trained interviewers in each of these countries. In every case, we sought interviewers who were co-ethnics, so that we did not have to worry about a sort of a respondent or interviewer effect. In every case, what we did was put together teams of people who would be talking to co-ethnics to the extent possible. The place where the survey took place were public spaces that we selected within each community, where we distributed these interviewer teams. Now, obviously, that makes it very much a non-probability sample. Insofar as we're getting a non-representative group, though, I want to point out that who we're selecting for is probably the ones we want. The people who are most likely to come into contact with the migrants and have that variation in X that we would need. On site, they were trained to randomize, and we also gave them extensive training seminars. I had some pictures, but I won't talk through those because I don't have the time. All right, so how did we apply this to the migrants eventually unsuccessfully? The main variable was a direct question. Have you been exposed to migrants passing through the country? They could have represented a backlash. In other words, a series of control variables just for this first pass. Economic concerns we represented by, it's a shorter term measure, but the hope was it captured the broader sense of economic optimism or pessimism, which is how your household finance is doing. Are they getting better, getting worse, or staying the same? To capture a cultural affinity, the concern was that some but not all of the respondents were Muslim. The migrants in large number, especially the ones that are getting all the attention from the news back in Europe, are also Muslim, so the thought was there might be some sense of cultural affinity. Years educated. Now, people sometimes use this as a socioeconomic variable, and they assume it's part of economics. People sometimes use education as a cultural variable. They assume it's acculturation to norms of tolerance. The fact is, we really don't know. So I'm not going to attach a label to it, but it gets both. And finally, you're born, and people have noticed age patterns in attitudes toward migrants. Once again, why? Well, it could be the older you get, the less your job skills are secure, and therefore it's an economic concern, or it could be age. You were trained in the old days before there were all these people going around the country, and you're not used to it, and they violate your sense of order in a way young people are not bothered. Okay, so the big punchline on the results, and the reason why I spent all this time describing what I think is this cool survey that I'm interested in, so little time telling you what we found is, for the most part, we found nothing as regards effective contact. Contact does not make you like these migrants more. Contact does not make you like these migrants less, at least insofar as asking for policy activity in your country. This model shows you the ethnic, we did it by ethnicity. These are the ethnic Albanians spread across 4 countries, Kosovo, Montenegro, Serbia, and then the reference category are Albanians. And yes, we got a little pattern here. The older you are, it affected your attitudes. The way this goes is low means you agree that you want government to act. High means you disagree. So the older you got, the more likely you were to disagree that government should do something about this. But what actually is making the most difference are the differences in the Albanians according to the country they live in. The fixed effects variables had all the power to the extent there was any power. And it's clear that the relationship to migrants in Albania was getting very different results than we were getting among the Albanians in these other 3 countries. And so we're just going to have to keep trying to break that down. We did not have in the paper, but we've looked at other countries, Serbia, Montenegro. We've already run versions of that model. Don't need the fixed effects because this is only Montenegrins in Montenegro and Serbians in Serbia that we looked at. But once again, exposure meant nothing at all, and is not helping predict it. So right now, I've got a neat survey. It's doing great stuff with ethnic divisions, and it's doing very little for